lecture of the Infosys Foundation Academic Development Program, and it shall be delivered by Professor Pradeep Gokhale. I request him and the Honorary Secretary of the Institute, Professor Shrikant Bahulkar, to come to the dais, please. On behalf of all of us, I request Professor Bahulkar to welcome Professor Gokhale on this occasion with a bouquet of flowers. Now, this program is being held under the Infosys Foundation Academic Development Program. So I request Professor Bahulkar to introduce the program to us as well as the speaker of this lecture.
Friends, it's a matter of great pleasure for all of us to welcome Professor Pradeep Gokhale this evening. He is going to speak on In Pursuit of Happiness, a Humanist Approach. As Dr. Bapat has said, this is the first lecture under the Infosys Foundation Academic Development Program undertaken by the Bhandarkar Oriental Research Institute. Professor Gokhale was appointed as a visiting scholar under this program for 2 months, January and February. And under this program, he conducted a course on Indian epistemology, Nyaya, Buddhist Jaina, and Charvaka. It was really a feast for us, a good food for thought. For all 7 consecutive Sundays from January 6th to February 17th of this month. Under this program, he was also requested to deliver a public lecture which is being arranged today. Besides, he has also completed a small research project on Buddhist Nyaya, Buddhist logic, transition from Dingnagar to Dharmakirti, a wonderful presentation which will be made available in the near future in print media as well as electronic media. I suppose most of you have been attending his lectures and do not need a new introduction of today's speaker. As I had said earlier while introducing him, Professor Gokhale is a great Sanskrit scholar and scholar of Indian philosophy, particularly Buddhist philosophy and Charvaka. And we have experienced the way of his presentation, the clarity of thought, which is revealed from his presentation and also from his books and articles. He is a very busy person, traveling to various places in India, attending seminars, conferences, giving lectures. He is a voracious reader and prolific writer. And soon he will be going to Thailand to attend a workshop where he will be discussing a very difficult Indian philosophical text composed by a Buddhist Pandit. I welcome him and request him to begin his lecture.
Friends, this is supposed to be a public lecture, and I was a bit hesitant about speaking in English, but I had prepared this lecture for an audience which contains foreigners also. But I mean, to create a bit, my language of thinking is mostly Marathi. Although I write in English many times, I am made to write in English, present in English because of the diverse audience. So I have prepared the talk in English, and I will be presenting it in the same way in which I have given the course. The whole lecture is in PowerPoint form, and I will be reading it, and so that you can also see it on the screen. But I thought that why not prepare at least a gist of the presentation in Marathi. So I will be first reading the Marathi gist, Marathi Goshwara, which will take about 10 minutes, and then I will turn to the English talk, so that some background will be created. प्रथमच मला हे स्पष्ट करू दे की मी एक साधक आहे, सिद्ध नाही. पण मी जेव्हा स्वतःला साधक म्हणवतो तेव्हा प्रश्न उद्भवतो की मी कशाची साधना करत आहे. वेगवेगळ्या सत्ताशास्त्रीय दृष्टिकोनांमधून या प्रश्नाचं उत्तर वेगवेगळं असू शकेल. कोणी म्हणेल की मी खरं म्हणजे ब्रह्माची साधना करत असतो, कुणी म्हणेल की मी खरं म्हणजे बुद्धत्वाची साधना करत असतो. पण अशी कोणतीही सांप्रदायिक चौकट न स्वीकारता हा प्रश्न विचारला तर त्याचं उत्तर असू शकेल की मी सुखाची साधना करत असतो. पण सुख म्हणजे काय? सुख आणि समाधान एकच का? सुख आणि आनंद एकच का? असे अनेक प्रश्न उद्भवतात. पण हा पारिभाषिक गोंधळ बाजूला ठेवून सुख हा शब्द वापरला तरी आपल्याला सुखासुखात फरक करावा लागतो. इंद्रिय संवेदनेने जाणवणारं सुख आणि मानसिक सुख समाधान यात आपल्याला फरक करावा लागतो. महाभारत शांतीपर्व आणि उदान वर्ग हा बौद्ध ग्रंथ या दोन्ही ठिकाणी आढळणारा एक श्लोक आहे. यच्च कामसुखम लोके यच्च दिव्यम महत्सुखम तृष्णाक्षय सुखस्यैते नार्हतः षोडशीम कलाम. इथे 3 प्रकारच्या सुखांमध्ये तुलना केली आहे. कामसुख म्हणजे इंद्रिय सुख, दिव्य सुख म्हणजे स्वर्गीय सुख, आणि तृष्णाक्षय सुख म्हणजे तृष्णा नाहीशी झाल्यामुळे होणारं सुख. इथे या श्लोकाचा लेखक तृष्णाक्षय सुख इतर सुखांपेक्षा मोठा असतं एवढंच म्हणत नाही, तर ते प्रकारताच वेगळं असतं, वेगळ्या दर्जाचं असतं असं म्हणत आहे. येथे आपण सुखसंवेदना, मानसिक सुख आणि सुखसमाधानी दृष्टी यांच्यामध्ये फरक केला पाहिजे. कामसुख हे इंद्रिय सुख आहे, तर स्वर्गीय सुख एक प्रकारचं मानसिक सुख मानता येईल. या दोन्हीपेक्षा समाधान वेगळं असतं, पण समाधानातही आपण 2 प्रकार करू शकतो. कोणत्या तरी बाह्यनिमित्ताने होणारं समाधान याला आपण नैमित्तिक समाधान किंवा सोपाधिक समाधान असं म्हणू शकतो. याउलट कोणत्याही निमित्ताशिवाय असणारं समाधान याला आपण निर्निमित्त समाधान किंवा निरुपाधिक समाधान म्हणू शकतो. या निरुपाधिक समाधानालाच मी माझ्या या व्याख्यानामध्ये हॅपीनेस आणि तिथे सुद्धा हॅपीनेस विथ ऑल कॅपिटल लेटर्स असं म्हणणार आहे. गीतेतील स्थितप्रज्ञ, वेदांतातील जीवनमुक्त, थेरवाद बौद्ध दर्शनातील अर्हत, महायान बौद्ध दर्शनातील बोधिसत्व की ज्याला अप्रतिष्ठित निर्वाण प्राप्त झालेला आहे, जैनांचा सयोग केवली आणि सांख्य आणि योग दर्शनाचा केवल ज्ञानी, हे सगळे निरुपाधिक अर्थाने सुखी लोक आहेत. अर्थात या निरुपाधिक सुखाचे 2 घटक आहेत. त्या दर्शनानुसार त्यांना अंतिम सत्तेचं जे ज्ञान झालेलं आहे तो एक घटक आणि दुसरा घटक मानसशास्त्रीय आहे. अंतिम सत्तेचं आकलन प्रत्येक सुखी माणसाच्या बाबतीत वेगवेगळं असू शकेल, पण मानसशास्त्रीय दृष्टीने त्या सुखाचं स्पष्टीकरण एकसारखं असेल. ते स्पष्टीकरण काय असेल हा प्रश्न आहे. अर्थात ते सुखसमाधान म्हणजे केवळ भौतिक सुखांची बेरीज आणि भौतिक दुःखांची वजाबाकी नसते. तसंच ते बाह्य घटकांनी नियंत्रित केलं जाणारं सुखसमाधानही नसतं, तर ती एक प्रकारची शांती आहे. बाह्य घटक सुखदायक किंवा दुःखदायक कसेही असोत, त्यांना तोंड देताना टिकून राहणारी ही शांती आहे. ही शांती हे सुख यांची प्राप्ती कशी होईल? विविध दर्शने सुखसाधनेचा भाग म्हणून त्यांना अभिप्रेत असलेल्या सत्ताशास्त्रीय ज्ञानाकडे बोट दाखवतात. पण माझ्या मते सुखाचा मार्ग म्हणून कोणतेही अतींद्रिय सत्ताशास्त्र मानण्याची गरज नाही. सुखाचा मार्ग म्हणून ज्याला आपण आध्यात्मिक साधना म्हणतो, असे काही जरी उपयुक्त मानले तरी त्या आध्यात्मिक साधनेसाठी सुद्धा आत्मा मानण्याची गरज नाही. ईश्वर, आत्मा, परलोक असं काहीही न मानता सुखसाधना शक्य आहे. सुखसाधनेच्या अशा 5 प्रारूपांची चर्चा मी या व्याख्यानात करणार आहे. एक प्रारूप म्हणजे समग्र नैतिक विकासाचं प्रारूप, दुसरं पुरुषार्थ साधनेचं प्रारूप, तिसरं विकारांचं नियंत्रण आणि तृष्णेचा नाश हे तिसरं प्रारूप, चौथं वर्तमान काळात जगणे हे प्रारूप आणि 5वं 4 ब्रह्मविहारांची साधना. पहिल्या प्रारूपाच्या बाबतीत आपण असं बघू की अनेक दर्शनांनी समग्र नैतिक विकासाची कल्पना मांडताना वर्तन, भावना आणि ज्ञान या तिन्ही पातळ्यांवर व्यक्तिमत्व विकासाची भूमिका मांडलेली आहे. बौद्ध दर्शनातील शील, समाधी, प्रज्ञा हे त्रिशिक्षेचं स्वरूप या प्रकारचं आहे. जैन तत्त्वज्ञानातील सम्यक दर्शन, सम्यक ज्ञान आणि सम्यक चारित्र्य हे त्रिरत्नाचं प्रारूप. तसंच गीतेतील ज्ञान, कर्म, भक्ती यांचा जर पूर्णयोगाचे घटक म्हणून विचार केला तर त्यातही बुद्धी, भावना आणि वर्तन यांचा एकत्रितपणे विकास कसा करावा याविषयीचा दृष्टिकोन दिसून येतो. दुसरं प्रारूप पुरुषार्थ विचाराचं आहे. अर्थ आणि काम हे स्वार्थप्रधान पुरुषार्थ आहेत, तर धर्म हा परार्थप्रधान किंवा सर्वार्थप्रधान पुरुषार्थ आहे. धर्माच्या नियंत्रणाखाली अर्थ आणि काम यांची साधना केल्यानेच माणूस मुक्त जीवन म्हणजे सुखाचं जीवन जगू शकतो, अशी पुरुषार्थ विचाराची एक मांडणी आपल्याला उपलब्ध होते. अर्थात या पुरुषार्थ विचाराची इहवादी पुनर्मांडणी करता येईल आणि तशी ती केली पाहिजे असं मी सुचवणार आहे. या ठिकाणी मोक्ष पुरुषार्थ हा अर्थ, काम, धर्म यांच्या त्यागात सामावलेला नसून तो त्यांच्या संयत आणि शिस्तबद्ध अशा साधनेत सामावलेला आहे असं मी म्हणणार आहे. यातून आपण डॉक्टर आंबेडकरांच्या निर्वाणविषयक एका मर्मदृष्टीकडे येतो की जी त्यांच्या द बुद्ध अँड हिज धम्ममध्ये व्यक्त झालेली आहे. तिथे निर्वाणाविषयी बोलताना आंबेडकर म्हणतात की निर्वाण म्हणजे तृष्णेचा नाश हे खरं आहे, पण निर्वाण म्हणजे इच्छांचा किंवा विकारांचा, पॅशन्सचा नाश नव्हे, तर ते विकारांवर नियंत्रण असते. निर्वाण म्हणजे कोणतीही अतींद्रिय स्थिती नव्हे, तर अष्टांगिक मार्गाची साधना करत जगणे म्हणजेच निर्वाणात जगणे अशी भूमिका त्यांनी मांडलेली आहे. चौथं प्रारूप आहे ते वर्तमान काळात जगण्याचं. हे प्रारूप 2 संकल्पनांच्या संदर्भात समजून घेता येतं. एक विपश्यना ध्यान आणि दुसरं कर्मयोग. विपश्यना ध्यान साधना करताना आपण त्या वेळची श्वासोच्छ्वासाची स्थिती, गती पाहत असतो किंवा त्यावेळी जाणवणारी स्थूल किंवा सूक्ष्म संवेदना, सुखद किंवा दुःखद संवेदना साक्षीभावाने पाहत असतो. ती कशी अनित्य आहे ते पाहत असतो. हे वर्तमान काळात जगणं असतं. वर्तमान काळात जगण्याचा दुसरा संदर्भ कर्मयोगाचा आहे. आपलं कर्तव्य निश्चित करताना त्या संभाव्य परिणामांचा जरूर विचार केला पाहिजे, पण एकदा कर्तव्य निश्चित झाल्यावर सतत भावी परिणामांमध्ये मन गुंतवणं म्हणजे वर्तमानात जगणं नव्हे. या उलट फलाची आसक्ती न बाळगता कर्तव्य कर्म करणं हे वर्तमान काळात जगणं असतं. अर्थात कर्मयोगाच्या संदर्भात 2 गोष्टींचं भान आवश्यक आहे. एकतर कर्मयोग याचा अर्थ निष्काम कर्म किंवा निरीच्छ कर्म नव्हे, ते आसक्तीरहित कर्म आहे, इच्छारहित नव्हे. आणि दुसरा प्रश्न आहे तो कर्तव्य कर्म कसं निश्चित करायचं याविषयीचा. परंपरेने असं मानलं की कर्तव्य काय किंवा अकर्तव्य काय ते धर्मशास्त्रानुसार ठरते. ही पारंपरिक भूमिका आता तपासावी लागेल. 5वं म्हणजे शेवटचं प्रारूप आहे ते 4 ब्रह्मविहारांच्या साधनेचं. 4 ब्रह्मविहार म्हणजे इतरांशी कसं वागावं याविषयीच्या 4 वृत्ती आहेत. मैत्री, करुणा, मुदिता आणि उपेक्षा या 4 वृत्ती आहेत. आपल्याला स्वभावतःच काहींच्याबद्दल मैत्री भावना जाणवते, काहींच्याबद्दल निसर्गतःच करुणा वाटते, काहींच्याबद्दल आपली निसर्गतः मुदितेची भावना असते, म्हणजेच आपण त्यांच्या यशाचा आपल्याला आनंद होतो. तर काहींच्या बाबतीत आपण स्वभावतःच उपेक्षा बाळगतो, म्हणजेच तटस्थ किंवा निरपेक्ष असतो. पण या आपल्या वृत्ती मर्यादित असतात. या वृत्तींचं सार्वत्रिकीकरण करणं सर्व व्यक्तींच्या बाबतीमध्ये मैत्री, करुणा, मुदिता आणि उपेक्षा या वृत्तींचा विकास करणं हे ब्रह्मविहार साधनेमध्ये अपेक्षित आहे. या वृत्तींमध्ये परस्पर समतोल साधण्याची कल्पना या ठिकाणी आहे. उदाहरणार्थ मैत्री, करुणा, मुदिता यांचा अतिरेक आसक्तीच्या दिशेने जाऊ शकतो. उपेक्षा वृत्तीच्या विकासाने या आसक्तीला आळा घातला जातो. याउलट उपेक्षा वृत्तीचा अतिरेक हा मनाचा कोरडेपणा किंवा कोडगेपणा ठरू शकतो. त्यामुळे उपेक्षा वृत्तीला मैत्री, करुणा, मुदिता यांच्या साधनेची जोड देणं आवश्यक ठरतं. या चारही वृत्तींची एकत्र साधना हा सुखाचा मार्ग ठरतो. मी या व्याख्यानात हे दाखवायचा प्रयत्न करणार आहे की नैतिक साधना, नैतिक पूर्णतेची साधना हा सुखाचा मार्ग आहे. ईश्वर, ब्रह्म, विदेहमुक्ती यांची साधना एक वेळ नाही केली तरी चालेल, पण नैतिकतेची साधना बाजूला ठेवून सुखाची साधना करता येणार नाही. आता मी माझ्या व्याख्यानाकडे वळतो. इतक्यात टाळ्या वाजवू नका. बंद करून पुन्हा सुरू करावं लागेल. ओके. So at the very outset, let me make it clear that I am a seeker, not one who has achieved the goal. I am sadhaka and not siddha. In the Buddhist terminology, I am shaiksha, not ashaiksha. But when I call myself a seeker, a question can be asked, what am I seeking for? The answer will vary according to the conceptual framework in which the question is considered. If I accept a particular metaphysical belief system, then my goal will be charged by the underlying metaphysics. If I would be an Advaita Vedantin, I would say that I am seeking for realization of myself as Brahman. If I would be a Jaina, then I would say that I am seeking for the final state of Jiva from which karmic matter has been removed completely and in which it releases the four infinities: infinite intuition, infinite knowledge, infinite bliss and infinite energy. If I am a Buddhist, I would say either that I want to attain final cessation or that I want to attain Buddhahood, depending upon whether I am Shravakayanin or Mahayanin. But if the question is asked without any sectarian commitment, then one natural answer is, I want to be happy. Of course, when we say we seek happiness, we are not always clear about the concept of happiness. What is happiness? Is it the same as pleasure? Even in English, sometimes the words pleasure and happiness are used interchangeably, but sometimes a distinction is made between pleasure and happiness. A sensuous pleasure is just pleasure, it is not happiness. Happiness can be called a sustained state of mind. Even if happiness is called a feeling, it is a mental feeling, not a sensuous one. But there can be degrees of happiness. We will come to that soon. In Sanskrit, the word sukha is used commonly for pleasure and happiness. Sometimes a distinction is made between sukha and ananda, such that sensuous pleasure can be called sukha, whereas agreeable mental feeling can be called ananda. But there is no rule that the word sukha cannot be used in the sense of ananda. We are told about three different kinds of sukha in a verse which is found in Mahabharata as well as the Buddhist text, Udana Varga. Yaccha kama sukham loke, yaccha divyam mahat sukham, trishna kshaya sukhasya ite narhata shodashim kalam. The three types of sukha mentioned here are kama sukha, sensuous pleasure; divya sukha, heavenly pleasure; and trishnakshaya sukha, the pleasure arising from cessation of craving. The verse says that whether it is sensuous pleasure or heavenly pleasure, it does not even form 16th part of the pleasure arising from cessation of cravings. Can these three types of pleasure be called pleasure in the same sense? Sensuous pleasure is an agreeable sensation. It may be intense but impure, mixed with pain and transitory. The so-called Divya Sukha is presumably not a sensation, though it is an agreeable mental experience. How intense it is not clear, but it is supposed to be much more pure and durable than the sensuous pleasure. Now, when the author of the verse says that the Sukha arising from cessation of cravings is far more superior, more than 16 times superior to the other two Sukhas, what he seems to suggest is that this Sukha is not only greater than the other two pleasures in degree, but categorically different from them. One obvious contrast between them is that the other two pleasures arise by satisfaction of craving, though the craving continues or even grows after the satisfaction. The first type of pleasure, on the other hand, arises from cessation of cravings and not from satisfaction of them. The distinction between pleasure and happiness may be significant here. The sensuous Sukha can be called pleasure. The so-called Divya Sukha, since it is mental and more sustained, could better be called happy state than pleasure. But the Sukha arising from cessation of Trishna, even if it is called happiness, is of a very different kind than the so-called Divya Sukha. Trishnakshaya Sukha is a happy state of being rather than a feeling or a mental experience. It is not generated by external causes and conditions. In order to distinguish this happiness from other types of happiness, I will express it as happiness. Happiness is on capital letters. A happy person in this sense could be equivalent to Sitaprajna of the Gita, Jivan Mukta of Vedanta, Arhat of Theravada Buddhism, Bodhisattva with Apratishtita Nirvana of Mahayana Buddhism, Sayoga Kevali of Jainism, and Kevala Jnanin of Sankhya Yoga, and so on. Each of these concepts of happy person has twofold connotation. One is that of an elevated psychological state of an embodied person. The other connotation is related to the metaphysical realization which the happy person is supposed to have had. The metaphysical realization might differ from person to person according to the person's sectarian background, and it may have a role in shaping his or her elevated psychological state. But the particular metaphysical realization cannot be regarded as the defining feature of the psychological aspect of happiness. I want to suggest that happiness is possible without any of the metaphysical frameworks. One can just believe in this world and embodied human existence in this world like a wise Charvaka would do and pursue the path of happiness. I am suggesting that a Jivan Mukta Charvaka is a genuine possibility. Here I am not having any specific metaphysical system as the center of my inquiry into the nature of happiness and the way to happiness, but I am having human being at the center. In this sense, it is a human-centric inquiry. So I have called it a humanist approach to the question of pursuit of happiness. Let me try to clarify how I understand happiness. I want to distinguish this happiness from two other concepts of happiness. One is happiness defined in terms of pleasures. The idea of happiness highlighted by hedonistic ethics is that of maximization of pleasures and minimization of pains. Personally, I feel that this type of happiness is a legitimate human goal. This is a natural, biological, as well as rational tendency of all of us to pursue happiness in this sense. One can pursue this as an individual goal and also may universalize it as a goal worth pursuing by all, as Bentham and Mill did in their utilitarianism. But this is not happiness with all capital letters. Becoming happy does not mean accumulating more and more pleasures and reducing sufferings. The second type of happiness is happiness conditioned by specific situations. We many times talk about happiness and unhappiness as our responses to certain situations. I may be happy about something and unhappy about certain other things. I may be happy about my financial condition today and unhappy about the condition of farmers in Maharashtra or all over India. To be happy about something and unhappy about something in this way can be justified. One cannot expect that one should be happy about everything and unhappy about nothing. Being unconditionally happy in this sense is a mark of insensitiveness or numbness. Of course, what one will be happy about and unhappy about can be different from person to person. It largely depends on the temperament of a person. One can also talk about development of one's temperament from moral and spiritual point of view. This too is different from what I call happiness. Now, if happiness is different from both the above types of happiness, what is it? First of all, I want to suggest that a happy person may not be having a feeling of happiness, but what is more important is that he or she, so I may prefer to call she, is not disturbed. She is at peace in diverse situations. Hence, Trishna-kshaya Sukha can better be understood as Shanti or Prashama. It can sometimes be felt as a feeling, but it may not always be felt. It is more a mode of being rather than a positive feeling. Though such a person, as a normal person, may pursue pleasures and avoid or reduce pains, she is not running after pleasures or getting disturbed by pains. She has developed a capacity to handle the situations of pleasure and pain with equanimous mind. Such a person is not happy because of pleasures or pains or absence of pains, but she is happy in spite of pleasures or pains. This becomes possible because she can maintain peaceful, balanced and equanimous attitude towards pleasurable and painful situations. We have the notions like samatva, titiksha, upeksha and madhyasthya in the Moksha Shastra literature of Hinduism, Buddhism and Jainism. They indicate this idea. I have suggested that a happy person may not always have feeling of happiness or pleasure, but she is at peace in diverse situations. Now one can ask, where from does this peace come? The metaphysical moksha-centric systems may immediately come forward with their conceptions of the path leading to the emancipation from suffering. These paths consist of two types of elements, empirical practical elements on the one hand and metaphysical on the other. These emancipatory systems generally attach prime importance to metaphysical vision as compared to the empirical practical aspect of the paths. Hence, the Advaita Vedantin would say that it is the realization of Brahman that will ultimately give peace. A Jaina might say that it is the destruction of all karmas leading to realization of the true nature of oneself as Jiva, as possessing infinite knowledge, intuition, energy and bliss. A Sankhyaite might say that it is the discriminating knowledge of regarding Prakriti and Purusha. A Buddhist probably will not refer to any transcendental metaphysical insight as a necessary prerequisite of peace. She may refer to empirical practical conditions such as cessation of craving caused by realization of impermanence and insubstantiality of all phenomena. In fact, this is the peculiarity of Buddhism, that it can offer purely empirical practical method of attaining happiness without reference to transcendental metaphysics. This empirical practical method involves developing morality and moral perfection with the help of concentration meditation and mindfulness meditation. It involves the development of the sublime attitudes, namely Maitri, Karuna, Mudita and Upeksha. One can say that this approach also has an element of spirituality, but I would say that this is spirituality without a spirit. Secondly, though the traditional Buddhism contains the belief in the doctrines of karma and rebirth, I submit that the methods of moral development and moral perfection and the techniques of meditation can be practiced fruitfully without such beliefs. Even a non-believer A person with materialist metaphysical orientation can follow these techniques successfully. In fact, this is a peculiarity of these techniques that they can be fruitfully practiced by believers as well as non-believers. The techniques themselves are secular and human-centric. They are not otherworldly, soul-affirming or God-affirming. We are in a complex situation. We are surrounded by people with different metaphysical belief systems. Each belief system claims that it gives a way to ultimate happiness. These belief systems often make exclusive claims that they alone are capable of giving ultimate happiness. This gives rise to disagreements and conflicts. In this kind of situation, if we are able to handle conflicts without personal malice or hatred, then it can be a part of the pursuit of happiness. My concern here is to focus on the ways to happiness which can be commonly pursued by both the types of persons, those who believe in transcendental metaphysics and those who believe in secular way of life. I will briefly discuss here 5 models suggested in philosophical traditions of India. First one is integrated moral spiritual development. Second is Purushartha approach, that is choice of proper goals and pursuit of them as regulated by dharma, development of altruism. Then third one is control over passions and cessation of cravings. Fourth one, living in the present. And fifth one is cultivation of sublime attitudes. Now, first model, integral moral spiritual development, behavioral, emotive, cognitive. While talking about the path leading to emancipation, different systems talked about an integrated path, which consisted mainly of the 3 aspects of a person: behavioral, emotive, and cognitive. The idea seems to be that in order to attain happiness, one's behavior should be morally regulated so that one's relation with others is harmonious. Secondly, one's passions or emotions should be under control so that one does not lose balance of mind. And lastly, both these aspects, namely moral regulation of behavior and control over emotions, should be supported by a strong cognitive understanding. Such an integrated approach was developed in Buddhism through the model of threefold training, which is called Trishiksha: Shila, Samadhi, and Prajna. Shila refers to right conduct, Samadhi refers to concentration of mind by which it becomes free from emotional disturbances, and Prajna refers to wisdom or insight into the nature of reality. Analogous to this was the Jaina model of 3 jewels, Triratna, which consists of Samyak Darshana, Samyak Jnana, and Samyak Charitra, in which Samyak Darshana refers to right faith, which takes care of emotional aspect, Samyak Jnana refers to right cognitive attitude, and Samyak Charitra refers to moral regulation of conduct. An important point to be noted here is that when Buddhists advocate Trishiksha, they advocate all the 3 to be followed in an integrated way. Similarly, Jainas claim that all 3 jewels together is the path leading to moksha. They advocate the pursuit of all the 3 together. In the Gita, we find the discussion of Jnana Yoga, Karma Yoga, and Bhakti Yoga as different roads leading to moksha. Jnana Yoga refers to the right understanding of reality, Karma Yoga refers to regulation of conduct, and Bhakti Yoga refers to channelization of emotions towards the ideal which is identified as God. Though in the Gita itself the 3 roads are presented as if they are alternatives applicable to the aspirants of different temperaments, some commentators of the Gita have presented them as parts of an integrated yoga. Hence, in spite of variations in formulations, different systems advocate an integrated path to happiness which consists of proper activization, regulation, and channelization of the 3 faculties: behavioral, emotive, and cognitive. Now I come to the second model, that is Purushartha approach, moral regulation of human goals. We find in ancient Indian literature, both in Shastric literature and in poetry, references to 4 human goals, popularly called Purushartha. They are Kama, pleasure, Artha, wealth, Dharma, fulfillment of obligations, and Moksha, emancipation. We find different formulations and configurations of these goals in this literature, and modern scholars also have offered different interpretations. In the present context, I would like to make the following clarifications. 1. As we have distinguished between pleasure and happiness, pleasures, particularly sensuous and aesthetic pleasures, will stand for Kama Purushartha, whereas happiness will correspond to Moksha Purushartha. Traditionally, moksha as a human goal is understood in 2 forms: Jivan Mukti or Sadeha Mukti, that is emancipation of a living person or embodied emancipation, and B, Videha Mukti, disembodied emancipation. I want to suggest that for a human-centric understanding of happiness, Moksha Purushartha should be understood as Jivan Mukti. The other type of Mukti, that is disembodied emancipation, could be either rejected or bracketed. There is an important issue, the third point, there is an important issue about the relation of moksha with other purusharthas. Here we have 2 main approaches, that of exclusion and that of inclusion. According to exclusivist approach, moksha being the highest and transcendent goal excludes all other goals. According to this approach, it is worthwhile to abandon all other goals for the sake of moksha. Hence, we have statements like Vihaya kaman yas sarvan pumanshcharati nispruhaha nirmamo nirahankaraha sashantim adhigacchati in the Gita. Then there is a statement by Shankara, Artham anartham bhavaya nityam nasti tatas sukhaleshas satyam. And again in the Gita, Sarva dharman parityajya mamekam sharanam vraja aham tva moksha sarva papebhyo mokshayishyami ma shuchaha. According to inclusivist approach, however, Kama and Artha are to be controlled or regulated in accordance with Dharma, and they are not to be rejected or condemned. Hence, we have statements like Dharma viruddho bhuteshu kamosmi bharatarshava in the same Gita. Then Dharmartha virodhena kamam seveta na nisukha syat, that is, this is in Kautilya Arthashastra. Here a clear distinction should be maintained between running after pleasures with attachment on the one hand and experiencing pleasure with the sense of equanimity and non-attachment on the other. Hence, according to the inclusivist approach, one can attain happiness by vigilantly following social moral obligations and pursuing individual goals within the limits of altruistic or universalistic moral pursuits. 3. It is true that there is a basic contrast between Kama and Artha on the one hand and Dharma on the other. As Professor Barlinge, my teacher, used to put it, Kama represents the relation I for myself, Artha represents the relation others for myself, and Dharma represents the relation I for others. In other words, Kama and Artha are essentially egoistic goals, whereas Dharma is essentially an altruistic goal. Or Dharma may better be called a universalistic goal. Here the main point is that our egoistic tendencies represented by Kama and Artha should be controlled and regulated by the altruistic or universalistic tendency represented by Dharma. This can give a proper direction to the life of a person. A person can experience inner peace by leading a life in this way. How is Dharma as Purushartha to be understood is an important issue in this context. The concept of Dharma is multidimensional, and it may not be worthwhile to pursue Dharma with all its dimensions. For instance, I would not prescribe Vedic ritualism as a part of Dharma, nor would I prescribe maintenance of hierarchical social order, which includes Varna Dharma, Jati Dharma, and so on, as a part of Dharma. Dharma for me should essentially stand for fulfillment of universal common values such as truthfulness and non-injury. It can also include control over passions. This leads us to the next model of the pursuit of happiness, that is, control over passions and cessation of cravings. My introduction of this model is inspired by Dr. B.R. Ambedkar's conception of nirvana, which he develops in the Buddha and his Dhamma. Nirvana is understood as a transcendent and ineffable state or an unconditioned dharma in classical Buddhism, that is, asamskrita dharma in classical Buddhism. It is also understood as the stoppage of the cycle of births and rebirths. Ambedkar secularizes the concept of nirvana and presents it in human-centric and psychological terms. For Ambedkar, nirvana is not to be attained as a transcendent goal, but it is to be lived through as a way of life. According to Ambedkar, living the life by following the Noble Eightfold Path itself is living in nirvana. According to him, nirvana amounts to cessation of craving. But now the question is, does it amount to cessation of passions also? Here Ambedkar held that a person living in nirvana has control over passions, but he or she is not supposed to be absolutely free from all passions. Ambedkar's conception of nirvana, since it marks cessation of cravings, can be identified as happiness, which we have been talking about. Now I come to the next model, living in the present. An important mark of a happy person is that she lives in the present. We are related with past through memory and imagination, and we are related to future through thinking, expectation, imagination, hope, fear, and so on. To say that a happy person lives in the present does not mean that she does not remember or think about past, nor does it mean that she does not think about possible or probable future. One can learn from the past for better life in the present, but if one lives in the past, it will make her unhappy. One can try to peep in the future, plan for the future, but if one lives in future, it can take away her happiness. The main point is that though one may be meaningfully related to past and future, she is not attached to past and future, and hence her relation with the past and future do not disturb her relation with the present. Two models are available in Indian traditions which provide for the idea of living in the present. One is Karma Yoga of the Gita, and two, mindfulness meditation. Karma Yoga as a way of living in the present. Of the three main yogas prescribed in the Gita, Jnana Yoga is metaphysically oriented, whereas Bhakti Yoga is religiously oriented. As compared to them, Karma Yoga is more secular and practical. In the Gita doctrine of Karma Yoga, there is a message to perform the duties as they are given without any attachment to the intended result. Hence, the Karma Yoga of the Gita can be understood as a way to happiness which has an appeal to live in the present. However, 2 points seem to be significant while adopting Karma Yoga. One question pertains to the determination of one's duty. The Gita prescribes that what is to be done and what is not to be done is to be determined on the basis of scriptures. Tasmat shastram pramanam te karya vyavasthitau. I will only say that we cannot recommend this policy today. The duties should be determined on rational and moral grounds rather than dogmatic or scriptural grounds. The other question is about the role of desire in the practice of Karma Yoga. Karma Yoga is sometimes called the way of Nishkama Karma, which means desireless action. But the concept of desireless action is not practically viable. I submit that Karma Yoga should imply non-attachment to the result of the action. It need not imply absence of desires. Now, second way of living in the present is mindfulness meditation as a way to living in the present. The Buddha in the sermons on mindfulness, Satipatthana Sutta and Mahasatipatthana Sutta, classified mindfulness into 4 kinds. Mindfulness of bodily objects, Kayagata Sati. Mindfulness of sensations, Vedananupassana. Mindfulness of mind, Chittanupassana. And mindfulness of doctrinal factors, Dhammanupassana. The practice of mindfulness meditation involves vigilantly observing in-breathing and out-breathing as they happen from moment to moment, observing internally, checking the kinds of feelings or sensations one experiences in different parts of body, observing how the sensation arises and passes away, regardless whether the sensation is pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral, whether it is gross or subtle, worldly or unworldly. It also involves observing the state of one's own mind, whether it has desire, aversion, or delusion, whether it is happy or unhappy, free or bound. Through this type of meditation, one realizes the changing nature of phenomena. Secondly, one develops the habit of seeing the things as they are, objectively, and avoiding subjective elements such as attachment and clinging. The late Satyanarayan Goenka has popularized mindfulness meditation. The 10 days Vipassana course launched by him starts by accepting the rules of conduct, Shila, as a vow to be followed during the course. Then the technique of mindfulness of breathing is practiced for the first 3 days. It is not pranayama, that is control of breath, but concentration on the natural course of in-breathing and out-breathing as it takes place from moment to moment. The next stage is mindfulness about sensations as they appear or do not appear in different parts of the body. It also involves awareness of impermanence of all sensations. Hence, Satyanarayan Goenka's course on Vipassana meditation focuses on two parts of Satipatthana: mindfulness of breathing, which is a part of mindfulness of body, and mindfulness of sensations, that is Vedananupassana. Through the emphasis on realization of impermanence, one learns in this course how one can live in the present in one's experiential life. The two methods, Karma Yoga, which one finds in the Gita, and mindfulness meditation, which is found in Buddhism, they are complementary to each other in their essence. Karma Yoga promotes living in the present in the field of performance of actions, whereas mindfulness meditation promotes it in the experiential field. Vipassana course concludes with the meditation of metta, that is loving kindness. It is a part of another important meditational and attitudinal practice promoted in Buddhism. It is the practice of 4 Brahmaviharas, or 4 sublime attitudes. I want to claim that it has its significance as a means to attainment of happiness. So let us turn to it now. So I will talk about the model of cultivation of 4 sublime attitudes, namely Maitri, Karuna, Mudita, and Upeksha. An important way to happiness is cultivation of morally sound attitudes with others. On this issue, Buddhism provides the doctrine of the 4 sublime attitudes, famously called the 4 Brahmaviharas. The 4 sublime attitudes accepted in Buddhism are metta, that is friendliness or loving kindness; karuna, that is compassion; mudita, that is appreciative gladness; and upeksha or upekha in Pali, non-attachment or equanimity. In the early Buddhist dialogues and also later works like Visuddhimagga, these sublime attitudes are discussed as the objects of meditation. As objects of meditation, they assume the form of wishes or thoughts or attitudes that one is supposed to cultivate in one's mind. Now let us consider the nature of the 4 attitudes one by one. Maitri, that is friendliness or loving kindness. The first sublime attitude is Maitri. Maitri can be understood as love. It is translated as loving kindness, but it is selfless love or love without expectation from the object of love. There are certain beings with whom we are naturally inclined to feel loving kindness, but this feeling is not to be restricted to them, it is to be applied universally. Of course, making a feeling universal is not an easy thing. It is to be done step by step, and systematically Buddhism developed a technique by which it can be done. Buddha Ghosha in Visuddhimagga explains how an aspirant should practice loving kindness, first in relation to oneself, then in relation to the teacher or preceptor or the equivalent, then in relation to the dearly loved persons, then in relation to the neutral persons, and then the hostile persons, and in this way make the attitude truly universal. Then karuna or compassion. Just as loving kindness is about happiness of all things, all beings, karuna or compassion is about sufferings of all beings. Karuna involves sensitiveness or concern about the sufferings of all beings and the wish or desire that the sufferings of all beings may be removed. There are certain beings, namely the unlucky and the unfortunate, who are obviously worthy of compassion, but this feeling is not to be restricted to them, it is to be applied universally. Like loving kindness, making compassion universal is not an easy thing. It is to be done step by step and systematically. Buddhism developed a technique by which it can be done. So Buddhaghosha in Visuddhimagga explains how an aspirant should practice compassion step by step. It should be practiced first in relation to wretched, unlucky and unfortunate persons. Then the evil-doing persons, although evil-doing person, although he may be happy. Then in relation to the dear persons, then in relation to the neutral persons, and ultimately in relation to the hostile persons, and in this way make the attitude truly universal. And then mudita, it is an attitude of appreciative gladness which is specific to happy and successful conditions of all beings. One may naturally feel gladness on seeing a dear and beloved person, but this feeling is not to be restricted to such persons, it is to be applied universally. All beings are to be filled with appreciative gladness by applying this model universally. So Buddhaghosha again explains how the aspirant should practice appreciative gladness step by step. So first it is to be practiced in relation to boon companion or a dear person, then in relation to the neutral persons, and then in relation to the hostile persons, and in this way make the attitude truly universal. We can say that the first three sublime attitudes, namely Maitri, Karuna and Mudita, constitute a whole. Upeksha, the fourth sublime attitude, seems to fall outside this whole. But in fact, it is meaningfully related to the whole. For that, it is important to understand the meaning of Upeksha. The word Upeksha is used in Indian philosophical literature in at least two ways. One meaning of the term is indifference, negligence, or avoidance. The other meaning is equanimity or an unattached attitude to the object. In the Buddhist theory of four sublime attitudes, the term Upeksha is used in the second sense, that is equanimity or non-attachment. According to the theory of Brahma Viharas, just as one has to extend the attitudes of Maitri, Karuna and Mudita towards all beings, one has to extend the attitude of Upeksha towards all beings. What does it mean? One has to develop equanimity or detachment towards all beings. One has to see beings as beings, irrespective of their pleasant or unpleasant characteristics. In this sense, Upeksha would be a kind of neutral attitude. It is natural for one to feel equanimity on seeing a person who was neither beloved nor unloved. But according to Buddhism, this attitude is to be generalized and extended towards all. Buddhaghosha explains how an aspirant should practice equanimity step by step. So it should be practiced first in relation to the neutral persons, then the dear person, then the boon companion, then the hostile persons, and then oneself. And in this way make the attitude truly universal. The cultivation of the sublime attitudes is a method of harmonizing our relationship with others. It can be understood in a larger framework of equalities and inequalities among living beings. This can be understood on the following lines. It is a fact that I can equate myself with other persons in some respects. I may be better than some other persons in some respect, and the other person may be better than me in certain other respect. Here, being better or equal can be understood in a general sense, including the aspects such as material wealth, power, intellectual success, moral strength, and spiritual achievement. In a way, we have to accept these objective conditions of wellness, betterness, or otherness, betterness or otherwise as facts of life. The three sublime attitudes, namely Maitri, Karuna, and Mudita, can be regarded as healthy responses to the conditions of equality and inequality. Maitri can be regarded as a healthy response to the condition of equality, whereas Karuna and Mudita can be regarded as healthy responses to the conditions of inequality. The last sublime attitude, namely Upeksha, which can be understood as the detachment or equanimity, is a regulating principle in the sense that it demarcates and regulates the scope of other three principles. Here the idea is that Metta, Karuna and Mudita, as the sublime attitudes, are worth practicing only insofar as they are qualified by equanimity or non-attachment. In fact, even their nature and scope is to be defined and demarcated in the light of the practice of non-attachment. Now I want to argue that the Buddhist theory of Brahmavihara suggests a program of moral development and moral perfection. Buddhist ethics can be appreciated as virtue ethics. It is not just concerned with moral laws or the consequentialist rules of conduct, but it is primarily concerned with the development of moral character and through that reaching a moral ideal. What is aimed there is not just happiness as the occurrent feeling, but a disposition or a way of being. It is aimed at what we have called happiness with all letters capital. The cultivation of four sublime attitudes gives a program not only of moral development, but it has a spiritual dimension. Here what I mean by spirituality should be made clear. Spirituality, according to me, is concerned with harmonization of one's relation to oneself. It neither presupposes belief in the existence of soul nor in that of God. According to my understanding, it does not presuppose other worlds and rebirth either. Of course, it does presuppose the existence of mind, that is, mental phenomena such as cognition, believing, recollection, imagination, volition, feeling, and emotions understood in their occurrent and dispositional senses. Spirituality is concerned with harmonization of them, removal of disturbances and impurities from them. It is concerned with being in purity and peace with oneself in this sense. Buddhism holds that our actions are preceded by mind. Morality and immorality of actions are determined by purity and impurity of mind, respectively. Purification of mind makes morality naturalized and perfect. In this sense, I identify spirituality with moral perfection. I would not like to give any metaphysical status to spiritualities above this. I have tried to suggest so far that the doctrine of four Brahmaviharas as formulated by the Buddha and developed by the Buddhists like Buddhaghosha is an important contribution to moral psychology. The doctrine constitutes a whole which, if practiced rigorously, can lead to moral development and moral perfection. Friends, I began by saying that I am a seeker, not a person who has reached the goal. So, I cannot share the so-called established ultimate truths, but I can share some of my ideas which I have formed on the basis of successful and unsuccessful thoughts and thought experiments as a seeker, and I have tried to do that. I may submit here that my interest in the theme pursuit of happiness is not purely academic, but it is very much concerned with the real life experience. The question before me is, can a non-believer like me be happy in the ultimate sense? I have tried to show that Trishnaakshaya Sukha can be called ultimate happiness, which is different from sensuous pleasure or conditioned happiness. It is the goal which can be pursued within human-centric framework without transcendental metaphysical beliefs. I have called it happiness with all capital letters. It is generally believed that the belief in Brahman or God, or at least in rebirth, is essential in order to attain ultimate happiness. I have tried to make a case for the pursuit of happiness which bypasses or brackets such transcendental beliefs. Happiness is really a moral spiritual goal, where spirituality is understood as moral perfection. And I understand truthfulness and non-violence as the basic moral principles which imply harmonization of one's relationship with oneself and others. I want to make a humble claim that pursuit of morality and moral perfection in the above sense is itself a source of inner peace. It can be called moral satisfaction or moral happiness and can be distinguished from sensuous pleasure and conditioned happiness. Even if there are losses and gains, ups and downs in my practical life, I can be at peace and happiness and can face and handle these uneven situations with equanimous mind. Here, a source of my peace can be my conscience, which says that I have chosen a morally right goal and I am pursuing it. I am pursuing truthfulness and non-injury. I am cultivating loving kindness towards all and ill will and hatred towards none. Now I want to claim that whatever I said by accepting a secular framework is relevant for the religious believers also. Whether Brahman is there or not, God is there or not, afterlife is there or not, the final spiritual goal articulated in religious metaphysical systems cannot be attained without pursuing morality and moral perfection. One can bypass the belief in God or Brahman or life after death and pursue morality and moral perfection, but one cannot attain the transcendent metaphysical goal such as God or Brahman or Nirvana by bypassing morality and moral perfection. So, thank you.
We can have questions, of course.
Sir, thanks a lot for this nice lecture. I have 4 different questions. The first question is, the samadhi which you have mentioned in this non-transcendental approach, so it is slightly confusing. So can it be samadhi can be a part of transcendental metaphysics? So there is slight confusion about it. The second question is, the concept of nirvana which Dr. B.R. Ambedkar has taken, is it purely from Buddhism or some other ancient philosophies also? My third question is whether there is any influence of Patanjali Yoga Sutras on Buddhism. And my fourth question is, the mindful meditation, whatever is described in Buddhism, doesn't it appear in close opposition with the dhyana of Patanjali?
Now, Now, samadhi is translated as concentration, and it is related to shamatha. First of all, I will start with the last 2 questions because there we have diametrically opposite views. I mean, generally it is presupposed that Patanjali Yoga is very ancient. Even some people claim that it is pre-Buddhist. Some people claim that it is post-Buddha, but it is the Patanjali of Yoga Sutra was the same as Patanjali of Vyakarana Mahabhashya and so on. There are various claims about that, but recently people have pointed out, and even earlier it was pointed out by Dasgupta, that in the 4th chapter of Yoga Sutra there is a refutation of Yogachara Buddhism, and therefore it might be posterior to Yogachara Buddhism. And there is also discussion of some of the points maintained in Vasubandhu's Abhidharma Kosha and Abhidharma Kosha Bhashya. So, most probably it is 4th century, second half of 4th century. So, Patanjali was very much influenced by Buddhism, and his theory of meditation is very much influenced by Buddhism rather than being other way about. And so I have recently written on this issue that probably Patanjali is trying to say using the empirical psychological material which is found in Buddhist sources. And of course, I am not claiming that the theory of meditation really stems from the Buddha, and before Buddha there was no theory of meditation. But Buddha himself took many things from the Upanishadic tradition but developed over it and introduced many new things, particularly this idea of mindfulness meditation is not found, because mindfulness meditation has the basic presupposition of impermanence. That is how, experiencing things how as they happen from moment to moment, and the whole concentration is on that and not accepting anything eternal or permanent. Whereas Upanishadic meditation mostly presupposes something eternal and focusing on that, and ultimately we have to reach that eternal goal. So the basic framework is different, and therefore you can say that mindfulness meditation was Buddha's contribution. Although the other types of meditation, such as just samadhi, shamatha type of meditation, concentration meditation, it may not be Buddha's own contribution, but he used that for developing his theory of meditation. So actually I should have talked about Patanjali Yoga also in this talk, particularly in connection with the integrated approach. Just as in Buddhism we have Shila, Samadhi, Prajna as an integrated approach, and that is reflected in Arya Ashtangika Marga. Similarly, in Patanjali we have Ashtanga Yoga, where also we have this kind of integrated approach. Although this Prajna element is not there, but Patanjali in the first chapter he talks about Rutambara Prajna, which is a result of Sabija Samadhi, practice of Sabija Samadhi, and through Prajna ultimately, Rutambara Prajna, ultimately one goes to Nirbija Samadhi. So it can form part of Ashtanga Yoga also. So there Yama Niyama will be concerned with conduct, that is regulation of conduct. Then this asana, pranayama, pratyahara, they can be regarded as the preparations for dharana, dhyana and samadhi. So Patanjali Yoga can also be understood as an integrated approach to one's development of one's behavior, development of channelization of emotions or regulation of emotions, and developing some kind of insight into the nature of reality. Although the nature of reality for Patanjali will be the Sankhya type of nature of reality, that is the distinction between Prakriti and Purusha. So that is my view about these last two questions. Now, Ambedkar's conception of nirvana, Ambedkar has, he had read a lot of material on Buddhism, and he has partly, he has just reproduced it and rearranged it, but partly he has also reconstructed it, because his approach was a secular approach, and he was looking at Buddha also as a rational secular thinker, and therefore he has reconstructed his views in that way. So wherever there were references to something transcendent, life after death, and now even when we are talking of nirvana, you can talk about nirvana as asamskrita dharma, which is almost something eternal. There are dharmas of two kinds, samskrita, conditioned and unconditioned. Asamskrita there does not mean uncultured, it means unconditioned. So there are certain objects which are unconditioned, uncaused, and nirvana is such a thing. And in Buddhist literature we find references to nirvana in that form. That is, nirvana is something which is already there, and we have to realize it, and it is asamskrita dharma. But then on some moments Buddha just kept silence on these issues, because wherever there was this question of eternality, then Buddha said that I don't accept eternality, but he had to talk about something like an eternal goal. So there is some kind of confusion in traditional Buddhism about the nirvana as the ultimate goal. So Ambedkar humanized it. It was a kind of reconstruction, according to me, of Buddhism. Not just, partly you can say it was a reinterpretation, but through reinterpretation, he was in a way secularizing Buddhism. Personally, I am for reconstruction of religion. You find that in the history, in every religion, there have been reforms. And reformers of religion, generally they try to reinterpret. They do not say that we are going against the founder of the religion. They will always say that I am really understanding the truth which the founder of the religion gave in a right way, and people have misunderstood him, so I am giving the right understanding. But actually many times these people gave new interpretations and reconstruction. So now today I will say that ultimately religions are human creations, although they may be very important and great human creations, but after all they are human creations and they are not fallen from heavens. And therefore we have every right to re-understand, reconstruct religion, of course in good faith, with proper attitude and approach of well-being of humanity, and not simply because it comes to my mind, so I will reconstruct and reform. So I am suggesting that such attempts for reconstruction should be welcome. Should be taken in the right spirit, and simply because he is saying something different from the tradition, we need not condemn that. So I think, okay, yes, please.
Yeah, here you have been, I think, assuming certain morality,
Okay.
it seems to me. But in real life, it seems to me the real big question before mankind is, in many situations, it is not clear what is moral and what is not moral. And I think Gita tries to address that question. Yeah, so can you just comment on that?
Who has tried to?
Gita, Bhagavad Gita, like just very in the simple words. Now, ahimsa and non-ahimsa. How do you decide? So my question is, it is not that for man, difficult question is to decide itself. What is the right thing to do?
Yeah, exactly. This is certainly true. You have raised a very important question. I have written on this issue. Personally, I think that when we are talking of morality, in Indian tradition, we have to talk about different dharmas. Okay, that is basically there is the distinction between sadharana dharma and vishesha dharma. So sadharana dharmas are common obligations which are applicable to all human beings qua human beings, as all human beings as human beings. Whereas Vishesha dharmas are applicable to living beings according to their social status, according to their birth, gender, and so on and so forth. So there can be Stri dharma and Pum dharma which are different from each other. There can be Jati dharma and Kula dharma, and so on. All these are Vishesha dharmas. Okay. Now the question is, when we are talking of morality, I am suggesting that we should emphasize Sadharana dharma element. And what are Sadharana dharmas? There we have the list of principles such as Ahimsa, Satya, Asteya, etc., etc. So we have to properly analyze all these principles. Now I am suggesting that Ahimsa and Satya. By Satya I do not understand truth in the metaphysical sense, but truthfulness to the other person. So truthfulness to the other person and non-injurious attitude to the other person, these are the most basic moral principles, and other moral principles can be derived from these. Whereas these two basic moral, if you are interested, I can also send the article by email or whatever. So these two principles are basic and they cannot be reduced to each other. So there can be sometimes conflict between truth and non-violence, sometimes. So how to harmonize these two principles in our actual life. This is the most important moral issue. Now, it is true that there is disorder in the society, and it is almost impossible for me to be 100% moral, or anybody for that matter. But then that also gives me pain or suffering. I mean, because internally I develop certain tensions when I am not honest to the other person, when I am not honest to myself. Similarly, when I am harmful to the other person, when I have hatred or ill will towards the other person. So these are the sources of pain and suffering. This is what these people like Buddha and others pointed out. Now, I will not regard Gita as a book of ethics in that sense, because in the Gita there is emphasis on Swadharma, which is Vishesha Dharma. And there is a reference to Sadharana Dharmas also, but there is no emphasis on Sadharana Dharmas as such. There is a kind of, you can say, ambivalence in the Gita. That is, sometimes there is emphasis on Vishesha Dharma, that is what Arjuna should do. It is according to his Swadharma. But how he should do, in order that he does not get the blemish for a wrong action and so on, for committing Himsa and so on and so forth. So there he has to follow the other paths such as Jnana Yoga and Bhakti Yoga and so on and so forth. So these two, what to do and how to do, so that one will not develop bondage. These two issues are there in the Gita, and there is a kind of tension between these two issues. This is my understanding of the Gita.
Thank you.
Yes.
According to Prarabdha, once Prarabdha, with these moral and immoral issues are there, so they may say it is once as per one Prarabdha, and then you have to reduce sufferings, you have to means खुद को माफ करना चाहिए, उसको भी ऐसा में that way you have to reduce the stress.
No, I mean this question of determinism, the question of Prarabdha is really the question of determinism. There is maybe because of past karma, but I will not say. I mean, I have some reservations about the doctrine of karma, which I have expressed in the same hall a few months back. But then the question is, suppose due to various conditions, my actions are determined. A Prarabdha can be one such condition. That is, because of my past karma, I am forced to do something, so this has become my Prarabdha, so to say. But so due to various conditions, my actions may be determined. But the question is that if you just take it in that way, that everything is determined and therefore there is no question of morality and immorality, that will not be good, because insofar as we are conscious, we are aware, and we are not under compulsion, insofar as there are certain options before us, there are certain alternatives before us. So in that sense, we at least feel that we are free to choose. Whether ultimately we are free to choose or not, that can be a different question. But I do experience some kind of freedom. And what should I do of that freedom? What kind of choice I should make? And there, if I make a right choice, from moral point of view, which is in accordance with, truthfulness and non-violence and so on and so forth, so that is certainly going to have some impact on my personality, on my mind, on my subconscious, and so I can be happy by developing my attitude towards different situations of freedom, situations of alternatives, situations of options. That is what I feel.
Sir, thank you very much for this informative and very inspiring talk.
Okay.
As a layman, I need a small clarity between happiness and peace. My question is whether whether happiness is a prerequisite for peace. Why I am asking this? The recent incident in Jammu and Kashmir, so nobody can be happy about it. So how does it affect peace, and whether it is interrelated? That is my question, a little clarity I wanted to have on that.
Now, of course, when I am talking of peace, I am not talking about peace in the society. I am peaceful condition in the society, but I am talking about inner peace, peace of mind of a person. Okay, so these situations are very, I mean, the sense in which you are using the word peace maybe seems to be different from the sense in which I am using the word peace.
No, what I mean is a man makes a society. So
Yes.
it is not the societal actually. It is my individual also. Ki I am
No.
unhappy and at the incidents individually also.
So what are you intending
So
to
how
say?
does it peace and unhappiness? How it should be?
No, as I said, I mean, I am just making some kind of conceptual analysis. That is, the word happiness can be used in conditioned sense and unconditional sense. So when I am using it in, there is conditional sense means due to various conditions, I can be happy or I can be unhappy. I mean, the present condition that you were talking about, it certainly makes her unhappy. So, and I am saying that yes, I mean, this kind of happiness and unhappiness is legitimate, and we have to go into this, that which conditions really should make us happy and which conditions can make us unhappy or should make us unhappy. This can be a legitimate inquiry, but the kind of happiness I am talking about is not that happiness. That is, in such conditions of happiness and unhappiness, can there also be some kind of peace of mind with which I am handling those situations? So that is the kind of happiness I am talking about. And that I say that is more closer to the idea of peace of mind. So with peace of mind, equanimity, whether I am able to handle these conditions which make me happy or unhappy. This is really the issue.
Thank you.
Yes.
Hello. The individual's happiness is increasingly being defined more by universal factors at work rather than individual's own psychology or understanding of the factors. This is one, how to
Yeah.
reconcile this situation. And secondly, in the talk, once you mentioned the word materialistic metaphysics, which I didn't understand, frankly. There was a mention of materialistic metaphysics or something.
Okay. Now I will first address the second question by materialistic. I don't know whether I have exactly used that word, but it is Charvaka metaphysics is regarded as materialist, not in the sense that Charvaka accepts only matter to be real, but according to Charvaka, consciousness arises from matter. It doesn't have any other source than matter, so it does accept consciousness. So materialistic metaphysics in this sense does not reject consciousness. Okay. Now coming, I did not understand your first question fully, but it is true that our happiness and unhappiness many times is determined by external factors, and this is really a matter of concern. That every day, all the time, there are different types of advertisements which are say telling us that this will make you happy, this will make you unhappy, so buy these goods if you want to be happy. And in this way they dictate what makes us happy and unhappy, and they don't allow us to think independently what will really make us happy and unhappy. This is certainly an important issue, and it is a matter of concern. I do accept that.
Sir, you may find my question very elementary, but still I ask. You have told happiness, all letters capital, and happiness just normal that. So what is the difference?
So one difference is conditional and unconditional happiness. Conditional happiness is due to certain situations, I become happy. When I become unhappy, so I become unhappy due to some causes, due to some conditions. That is what we experience. But becoming a happy person, when happiness characterizes a person as such, life as such, then it is a different type of happiness. It is not just momentary happening. So I become happy, I become unhappy. It is not just becoming happy or unhappy, but being happy. So being happy is different from becoming happy. And this is one of the distinctions.
We are running out of time.
Okay, so
Yeah.
two questions. Last two. Okay, sorry. Please.
It's a small or maybe a stupid question also. How to conciliate the morality of, suppose, Patanjali Yoga Sutra and the morality of Bhagavad Gita? Bhagavad Gita Krishna encourage Arjuna to the war. That appears like contradiction with the ahimsa. And some other things also. And then you speak something just now, something about Bhagavad Gita. And then you give me some light, this how conciliate this both morality, no?
I mean, it is a long question. I mean, for answering this, I think it cannot be answered in a moment or so, because certainly in Patanjali Yoga Sutra, where yamas are regarded as Mahavrata, that is a great vow, and which is regardless of one's birth, conditions, time, and so on, desha, kala, they are to be followed. So ahimsa is to be followed in all situations, in all conditions, according to Patanjali, whereas Gita roughly follows the varnashrama dharma, varna dharma, ashrama dharma, mainly varna dharma. So it is duty of a kshatriya to engage in a war. So that becomes primary, and the universal principles become secondary. Of course, even in that kind of framework, even in ahimsa framework, one cannot say that at any condition one should not enter into war. In that case, only war will be a kind of what can be called apad dharma. The idea of apad dharma can be used in order to introduce war in the general framework of satya and ahimsa. I think. I mean, that is of course a different type of answer.
So what do you think about if we believe dharma, karma and karma siddhanta, or rebirth, birth and rebirth? So that will, if you believe all these things, that will give you a guideline or work as a torch to follow the right path.
I'm sorry,
on morality.
I don't believe in that.
Okay.
And because I think that also does not give me right path. Because that gives me an impression that already there is some kind of universal justice. And therefore, I don't have to do much for maintaining that justice. And even if I find the situations of injustice, the situations of suffering, I will just say it is because of past karma of the related beings, and therefore I don't have any duty towards that. So whereas personally I believe that I mean the situations of injustice, situations of suffering and pains, they are something with which I have to do something. And I will not just interpret those things in terms of karma and rebirth.
Thank you.
Sorry. Now let them decide whether. Yes. Okay.
You said this happiness and all that.
Please give mic.
I think you can understand that without.
Hello.
you are saying that happiness is a state of mind as interpreted by your Buddhism or Buddhist philosophy approach.
No, it is not.
Yeah, whereas happiness is a state of mind for different people. What they think that I say that, you know, if it is Bhagavad Gita type or Hindu Dharma, I don't know. But I would say that, okay, somebody has a happiness. I have heard lectures of Mr. Chinmayanand when I was a schoolboy. And he said, all right, I took a bunch of flower and went to one of my friends and she rejected me. So it's not a state of happiness for him. Whereas somebody might have a glass of beer and he may feel happy. These are two different interpretations, I think, based on your treatise of Buddhism. Approach to happiness, approach of Buddhism to happiness, rather than a Hinduism approach to happiness.
So first of all, this is not the Buddhist approach. You can say this is a Charvaka approach. I will not mind much. This is not. I mean, I have talked about Sita Prajna of the Gita, then Sayoga Kevali of Jainism. So different schools of Indian philosophy have this conception of happiness, which I call, say, unconditional happiness. Being happy, not just becoming happy due to this or that situation. So all these systems have that. And then how to attain that happiness? Then they suggest some paths, some suggest some means. In that means there are two aspects. One is metaphysical aspect and the other is empirical psychological aspect, moral psychological aspect. So I am suggesting that we should better emphasize moral psychological aspect rather than metaphysical aspect. Because metaphysical aspect is diverse, there can be differences of opinion, but moral psychological aspect will be more or less common. It will be shareable. That is what I have been trying to say. So it is not at all, say, Buddhist or anti-Hindu or anything of that kind. I mean, sorry. Yeah.
Thank you so much, sir. On behalf of all of you, let me express our happiness on being able to listen to Professor Gokhale's so much elucidating and enriching lectures. And this is a continuous state of our mind since last month. Thank you very much, sir. We feel privileged to have you here. As stated earlier, this lecture was a part of the academic development program initiated with the generous donation given by the Infosys Foundation. We extend our heartfelt gratitude towards the foundation. Live webinar of this program is possible through the efforts of Dr. Vijay Bedekar and his team in Thane. I thank them for making our online presence lively. I extend my gratitude towards this August gathering. Thank you all. And with this, I declare that this function is over. Thank you so much.